Greta Thunberg, Part 3, Empath or Narcissist. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. We have Greta Thunberg under the Tudorscope as we look to ascertain whether she is a narcissist, narcissistic but not a narcissist, a normal or an empath. And as part of doing so, we have to examine her familial relationships. We've already looked at the situation with her father, but now we turn to her mother. Sarah Magdalena Ernman, born on the 4th of November 1970, is professionally known as Milena Ernman. She's a Swedish mezzo-soprano opera singer. Besides operas and operettas, she has performed chansons, cabaret, jazz, and appeared in musicals. She's a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Music. She also represented Sweden in the Eurovision Song Contest in 2009, finishing in 21st place. The fact that she is a performer demonstrates that she will have some strong narcissistic traits. All performers do. It does not mean that they are a narcissist, but the fact that they have the ability to perform in front of people, to go up on a stage, to engage in those performances, demonstrates that they will have certain strong narcissistic traits likely to be showcasing and vanity. Her career was taking off when Greta Thunberg was born, and it was her husband who decided to stay at home to look after their daughters. Might this exhibit a somewhat selfish attitude of the mother that she wanted her career to come first, or was it simply the case that between them the father decided that you are going to be the one that's got a more successful career and earning more money, and therefore it makes sense for me to be somebody that stays at home? It's worth pointing out that in Scandinavia, the domestic balance between husband and wife is much greater than it is in other parts of the world, with men taking on a much greater share in relation to being house husbands or catering to childcare, or certainly the burden is shared far more equally. And therefore, in essence, the fact that he chose to do that is not particularly unusual of itself in Scandinavia, and therefore might simply be the case, rather than it be a controlling wife who wants her own way and is acting selfishly, but rather a common occurrence in a marriage of two Swedish individuals. It was the case, as explained, that Greta Thunberg had health issues of her own. In August 2014, when she was 11 years old, she suddenly stopped eating, talking, reading, or wanting to do anything. This condition lasted for several months, and she was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism. As mentioned in part 2, I'll be returning to her ill health episodes to determine what that might tell us about her. Interestingly, the acute period of her daughter's condition affected her mother and her family to such an extent that she had 3 breakdowns during her professional activity. Is this a consequence of somebody reacting to a threat to control posed by her daughter's behaviour? Or is it the case that she has such sufficient emotional empathy for her daughter, that she cares about her so much, that the clearly very serious health condition of her daughter affected her to an extent that she had breakdowns herself? It resulted in numerous of her performances being cancelled. After the crisis was overcome, she turned to the nationwide daily newspaper Expressen in Sweden, which reported in detail on what had happened, because she wanted to help other families in a similar situation. Is this again emotional empathy being exhibited on the part of the mother by wanting to help other families, or is this a lack of boundary recognition generated by oversharing, the need to talk about what has gone on? The self-importance of believing that people will actually be interested in what has gone in your family. As I mentioned in part 2, the family has a memoir. It's called Our House is on Fire, Scenes of a Family and a Planet in Crisis. Although the whole family have contributed to it, it's her mother who's done most of the writing. Again, might this be indicative of an individual that lacks boundary recognition, that is somewhat self-absorbed and thinks that the world ought to know about everything that goes on in relation to their family? Might this demonstrate an absence of emotional empathy by putting all of the family's activity out there? Or is it simply the case that this is a recognition that people will be interested in the family because of the fame that Greta Thunberg has achieved, and that they're providing that information? Naturally, as a consequence of this, the concerned mother witnessed what was happening to her child and was involved in ensuring that she got suitable help. The mother wrote, she cried at night when she should have been sleeping. She cried on her way to school. She cried in her classes and cried during her breaks. She'd stopped engaging entirely. Ehrman talks also about what the catalyst was, as I mentioned in part 2, namely the video that Greta Thunberg had watched in relation to a massive island of plastic which was adrift in the South Pacific. Her mother tells in the memoir that Thunberg was diagnosed with autism and obsessive-compulsive disorder, and talked about how it causes Greta to see the climate crisis in black and white. Her mother describes this perspective in the memoir as a clarifying gift. Greta has a diagnosis, she wrote, but it doesn't rule out the fact that she's right and the rest of us have all got it wrong. Is she correct to determine her child's diagnosis as a clarifying gift? Or is she making something more of it than it ought to be? Is she putting her daughter on a pedestal? Similarly, in the memoir, her mother depicts how Greta's recovery from her mental health crisis was bolstered by her activism, and specifically her choice to skip school in August 2018, when she sat outside the Swedish Parliament clutching a sign that read "School Strike for Climate." Her parents had no idea that this simple action would launch a global movement. They were not enthusiastic. Erna also states that they were concerned about the attention they knew it would draw to their child, who had only just begun to reclaim some normalcy in her life. But, like her husband, she witnessed the fact that her preparation for the activism made her feel good, and therefore they allowed it to take place, even though they had reservations about it. Similarly, just like her husband, she also was wary of allegations that she and her husband would be accused of putting Greta up to it, something which they have rejected repeatedly. The mother has explained that their daughter spoke to curious passerby and answered questions from journalists who stopped to interview her about what was going on. She stated, "I promise that any parent whose child hasn't talked to people for several years and could eat only a few things in a few predetermined places will be extremely happy to see those complications vanish," her mother wrote. It's almost like a fairy tale. The fact that when she was engaging in her activism, she ate an entire container of vegan noodles delivered to her by a friend on the third day of her strike and was talking to complete strangers was a complete contrast to her earlier behaviour. Again, the delight that her parents exhibited as a consequence of this presumably is demonstrative of their emotional empathy for their daughter, because they were concerned at what was happening. In relation to her mother, there doesn't appear to be on the face of it any history of difficult relationships. Her relationship with her husband is not one that is fraught with contentious elements, breaking up. They have remained together, supporting their daughter. Of course, narcissists can remain in relationships for decades, but there doesn't appear to be any evidence that supports the contention that theirs is a difficult relationship. And furthermore, it doesn't seem to support any contention that the environment that Greta Thunberg was brought up in was one whereby it was abusive. There's no evidence to suggest that she was physically, sexually, or emotionally abused by her parents. On the contrary, they appear to have been supportive. Of course, one has to keep in mind that there quite possibly could be a very carefully manufactured facade at place, one whereby the parents have influenced their daughter, which would demonstrate a lack of control in relation to the activism by encouraging her to behave this way. This denied choices to her, that they brainwashed her and thereafter have sought to ensure that that brainwashing has been kept quiet by the issuing of a memoir which puts a narrative on their terms. It's a possibility that in actual fact one or both of them has exhibited significant amounts of control over Greta Thunberg by ensuring that she has become not only involved in activism, but that she has remained brainwashed to the influence that her parents have, to the extent that she doesn't even recognize it, hence why she has not spoken out about it, and that they have repeatedly controlled the narrative through interviews and a memoir so that they ensure their version of events is one that is portrayed to the media at large. One must keep that in mind as a possibility, albeit they have been repeatedly consistent in the messages that they have provided, which is somewhat unusual for one or more narcissists, as they invariably contradict themselves. There hasn't been any evidence provided by other members in the family to suggest that something untoward has been taking place in respect of the upbringing of Greta. Grandfather, grandmother, etc. have not spoken out. Uncles and aunts have not spoken out. And therefore, at this juncture, it would appear that Greta Thunberg has had a stable upbringing, notwithstanding her own mental health challenges, with two parents who appear to have been supportive, and therefore that may well suggest the presence of emotional empathy by both mother and father. Or could it be that they are particularly controlling and they've been particularly devious, that there is one or more very evolved narcissist who has influenced their daughter to such an extent that they've controlled the narrative and the story magnificently so that she hasn't even realized that she has been brainwashed. There's no actual direct evidence of that having taken place, but as I say, it is something that we do need to consider in relation to the influences that have forged the personality and character of Greta Thunberg. Thus, this is the familial background that we are aware of. She also has a sister. There's not a lot written about her sister. There's no evidence of Greta and her sister having any form of contentious, conflicting or tumultuous relationship. Apparently they've got a lot in common. They both love dogs, they have a family commitment to environmental protection, and they've both experienced mental illness. Apparently the sister was diagnosed with ADHD, Asperger's, and OCD, along with oppositional defiant syndrome. Aside from those diagnoses, there has not been any evidence of interpersonal issues between her and her parents or her and her sister, Greta. And therefore, in the circumstances, it would appear that a good relationship exists between her and her sister. Thus, that's the picture with regard to the family Thunberg. We're now going to move on to other relationships that Greta Thunberg has had in her so far relatively limited period on this planet. Join me in part 4.